Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm excited to be able to present in the autumn school this week. Is everything okay with the channels? I should ask. Okay, great. And thank you for the introduction. Thank you to Pavlo for the excellent organization today, and to our admin team. So yeah, my name is Monika Egerer, and I am a tenure track professor here at the Technical University of Munich. I actually sit in Weinstefan in Freising, which is a smaller town right outside of Munich. And I'm originally from the United States, and this is where I became very interested in urban farming and urban gardening as a more sustainable land use strategy, specifically in the city. So I will show a little bit today of some of the pictures that I've taken from urban farms and gardens across the world. And this is one of the photos from a community garden that I worked in during my PhD in California in Santa Cruz, where there is a large Hispanic population. So many people from Mexico and Latin America and South America make their way to California to work in the lettuce and strawberry fields. And in their free time, the little that they may have during the growing season, they cultivate small patches of land in our cities, in our Californian cities. And so this is a picture of a garden, and this sign says Mirando al Futuro, so looking towards the future. And so this garden may look very backwards from what we consider progress and sustainable large scale and more industrial agriculture. But this is where some people teach their children about food and food production and agriculture and practice their traditional livelihoods. And so while some may see this as looking backwards, I think it's a mix of both. It's looking back to the history of agriculture and how it may contribute to our future cities. So I really like this photo, and I like to start some of my lectures with this photo to think about the very different ways that we practice agriculture in the city and the different times and histories and cultures that it also represents. So there is in the past decade a growing movement for urban agriculture. And there's been a suite of scientific studies that have highlighted the potential of urban agriculture for food security and for urban greening. And so one of the studies that I will start with is one that has used a lot of big data sets to show that there is a huge potential and potentially under-tapped potential for urban agriculture. So this is the study here that says big data suggests big potential for urban farming. And this was done in 2017. And what they did is basically created a model that is a comprehensive model looking at land cover data, as well as agricultural production data, that can analyze the benefits of what we consider ecosystem services, something that Julia Schmuck presented on Monday, of urban agriculture at a global scale. And so what they did is they estimated the potential space available for urban agriculture worldwide. So where is there space within the city? They implemented different cropping type scenarios. And then they also assessed different ecosystem services that could be produced from these different crop type scenarios. So here they considered food production, nitrogen fixation, pollination, biological control, stormwater runoff, energy conservation. And what they found is that, yeah, urban agriculture could yield up to 10% of many food crops, plus host a suite of other positive benefits. So this is just what this, a visualization of what this may look like. So if we are thinking about land cover data, we take all of these big satellite images and we look at where, for this study, where there's land use available. And so for this study, what they did is they looked at rooftops, they looked at vacant land, and they looked at vertical area. And here are just some pictures of what urban agriculture in these different spaces may look like. And what they found is, I keep saying that there's big potential for urban agriculture. So about 7 to 11 million hectares of total available vacant land. And this is in terms of potential ecosystem services. And they found that there's could be, almost 200 million tons per year in food production. This, of course, varies based on the location that this could be the cities that this could be implemented in. But they estimated about 5 to 10% of worldwide production. And so they also found that there's a big potential for energy savings and stormwater reduction. So especially when we're considering energy savings, if we can put urban agriculture on a rooftop and use the building's energy, then we are putting energy into, or we're creating a more circular system. So the inputs that we are using to grow crops may, in another scenario, just be waste. So again, this amounts to a lot of billions of dollars when we think about food production and energy savings and potential cost reduction, and also a significant global economic output. Some of the challenges that they found were that, soils may be polluted in cities, which is something that we've also talked about in the past few days. The buildings where you may implement an urban garden or an urban farm may not have the proper infrastructure. And this certainly depends on the climate zone. And so this is a really simple model, and we can ask ourselves, what are they ignoring when just thinking about land cover and just thinking about different crop scenarios? We also have to think about governance and politics. So is zoning fit for agricultural production in residential areas or in business districts? So there's a lot of things that you may ignore in a very simple model. And so, that tells us that there's huge potential for urban agriculture worldwide. But they also say that, well, this is a big model. We're saying that there's a lot of potential if we look forward, but actually there's studies that have been done decades earlier that tell us that there's over 800 million urban farmers already. So this is a big trend. We can say that there's big promise, but actually people are doing this already, and this is an important practice that we should consider. And we should also be considering what are the different ways that people are engaged in more sustainable practices. So where we are minimizing resource, or I guess non-regenerative resource inputs. And what are different ways that we can promote a diversity of ecosystem services and not just focus on crop production. So I would like to also start with a little exercise to ask you what you think urban agriculture is, especially to you. So I would love if everyone could take 20 seconds or 30 seconds or however much time we have today to just describe or sketch a form of urban agriculture that you are most familiar with. So if we had more time, I would do a share back, but just take a second and do this for yourself. So maybe if I could have one person from the audience volunteer their drawing, that would be great.
Any volunteers?
I can't draw, but go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, drawing.
If you have a drawing, that's great. If you would just like to share a story, that's also okay. We all have different talents, so I accept both forms.
I can share a description. I cannot draw, but
Okay,
I
great.
have sort of urban or like neighborhood plots with allotments, people coming in and taking care of their, couple feet of, garden bed. That's kind of what I think of.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so this is also a system that I'm very familiar with. So thank you for sharing that. So people may think of allotment gardens and community garden plots within a neighborhood. So this is one thing that comes to my mind. So my grandfather lived in New York, and he was a beer distributor. And so he would recycle all of these beer barrels that he would use to grow his tomato plants in. And so when I was a child and would visit my grandparents in New York City, in Queens, and go to my grandfather's tiny little backyard, that he had, it was filled with these big, to my small eyes, these big beer barrels that would also grow tomato plants and pepper plants and cucumbers, and would form the base for the salad that we would eat in the hot summer nights in the backyard. And so I just use this example because it also is one point that I want to emphasize today, that urban agriculture doesn't need to be large scale. It can also be very small scale and occur on balconies and in small little backyards. So we have a wide diversity of what we consider urban agriculture. So here are just some photos that we can consider across the world. So we want to consider urban farms like in Detroit that are being implemented as a revitalization strategy in the city because the city has shrunk in population, and many buildings have been cleared and land made available for large scale farming. And then we also have these community garden plots. We have rooftop home gardens or community gardens. And we also have forms of like peri-urban agriculture, or agriculture occurring as the city basically engulfs previously agricultural land, and in slum neighborhoods like here in Nairobi in Kenya. So there's many different definitions of urban agriculture, and this is something that Peter Anihöfer in his lecture on agroforestry brought up, that, yeah, we can look through all these definitions and where there's similarities. One very simple definition that I like from Oregon State University is the production, considering processing and marketing of food, flowers, fiber, feed, herbs on land and in water dispersed throughout urban and peri-urban areas. So this is just one definition. It tries to be very inclusive of all of these different forms of production, and also may include fish, for example. So about 36% of urban areas are currently used for crop production. This was a study done in 2000, and then also in 2017, this was reported. So actually the data on urban agriculture is relatively old. And I'm trying to get people to do more like global analyses on the current practice of urban agriculture in cities worldwide, not just in Europe or the global north, where we have better land cover data potentially. And here again is also a nice photo of one of the largest urban farms in the United States. Well, previously existed. This was in Los Angeles, and also is a nice visual representation of where agriculture pops up in very dense urban areas. And so it's important to note that urban agriculture is not a new phenomenon, like I mentioned before, but is a part of ancient civilizations. And today it is used as revitalization efforts in some cities, like in Detroit. And what we consider urban agriculture depends on our definition of urban versus rural. So when we are trying to define an urban area, we usually characterize it by the population and the land use cover. So population, at least in the United States, it's an urban area if it's more than 50,000 people, and this is usually like a big city or like a bigger city, that it then, or I guess a mid-sized city to a big city. And rural is anything that's not urban. So you have this like dichotomy, which isn't necessarily the best, but also land use is a good indicator. So where is their impervious surface or high building density? But it's also important to note that urban is also a lifestyle versus rural. So the cultural aspects and the daily life of someone who lives in the city or a town is different from someone who lives maybe in the countryside or a more rural area. So about over half of the global population lives in urban areas. We're seeing a loss of green space, also a loss of connection to food. There's already a significant portion of urban areas that have been stated to be in focus for crop production. And so urban agriculture has relevance for multiple reasons. It also has relevance because it's a part of what we consider the green infrastructure of our cities. So urban green infrastructure includes forest and habitat fragments in the landscape. It considers parks, it considers cemeteries, any kind of, maybe just green space within a city roundabout. So there's many forms of green infrastructure, and gardens, farms, vertical facades are all a part of green infrastructure. And so we can think about these different forms of urban agriculture, and we also want to consider the multiple functions that they have. So they are contributing ecosystem services, like we have discussed for the past couple of talks around biodiversity or water storage or soil restoration, and also some of these cultural services like mental health benefits or creating social cohesion with people that may be using a community garden or an allotment plot. And so we have urban agriculture at the residential scale, like I talked about with my grandfather and his tomato plants. This is relatively small areas of cultivation that add supplementary food for a household. It's often not commercial. But we can think that these small patches of backyard or front yard garden space can add up across a city. So here are just some calculations that we have for, sorry, mine is very US focused, but an example in some US cities. And then we also think about community scale. So it may be a little smaller areas as far as when we think about larger urban farms, but may involve more people in the space to cultivate together, and can be productive depending on the motivations of such a community garden, as well as the resources that the garden may have. We also have more commercial agricultural endeavors that are more profit-driven and want to sell their outputs. We have rooftop systems that may be amenities for residents in a building, such as this farm in an apartment building. And I think this is somewhere in Tokyo or in Bangkok. And also vertical farms where we have a more controlled environment, and we'll hear more about that tomorrow. We also have some nonprofit farms and gardens that focus on education or maybe on a volunteer basis, and they're not just based on commercializing the endeavor, but also want to diversify the income streams that they have. So this homeless garden project is one example in Santa Cruz, where I used to live in California, where it is also a training program. So those that that are jobless or do not have a home, they can stay at this garden and learn how to do sustainable horticulture. So a lot of inputs go into an urban agricultural system, both people, as well as resources. And this considers also financial support and any support services. So many urban agriculture projects rely on grants or donations, and they require technical assistance or some kind of network that supports them. And yet we also then have a lot of outputs that we may consider benefits of urban agriculture. So we have aspects of health, so connecting or having access to healthy food and healthy eating. We have social aspects such as education about where food comes from or learning about agriculture and horticulture. And then economic aspects, if we can provide jobs to people or stimulate the local economy. And also ecological benefits, so around conservation or soil improvement and stormwater management. And what's important here is that we want to link the different forms of urban agriculture. So whether it is a household plot, whether it is a community garden, whether it is a for-profit farm with agrobiodiversity or biodiversity within the system, so of plants, vertebrates, as well as invertebrates, to also ecosystem services that the system provides. So whether a system is able to provide temperature regulation, so things like urban cooling or natural pest control, or water storage and carbon storage. And then also what may be disservices. So maybe through bringing in different kinds of ornamental plants to a system, we are having new kinds of pests and pathogens that may spill over to other green spaces in a landscape. And so one aspect that I was asked to talk about is agrobiodiversity. So agrobiodiversity is a subset of natural biodiversity, and this includes plant genetic resources used for food and agriculture. So here we're thinking about cultivars, land races, ecotypes, weedy plants, and wild relatives. And the maintenance of this variation within agricultural crops provides goods and services that support ecosystem functioning, resilience, and productivity. And so when we think about sustainable agriculture, agrobiodiversity is really a core of the sustainability and the resilience of agroecosystems to potential disturbances. So here are just some examples of different types of corn, as well as different types of, or I guess cultivars of potatoes. And urban agriculture and small scale agriculture can have a lot of inter and intra specific plant genetic diversity, especially in terms of these different crop varieties and land races that are more traditional or not necessarily sold by giant corporations or companies. And in home gardens especially, many studies have shown how families, through engaging in food production just for subsistence, so for their own families, or for small scale or selling at a small scale in a market or in the neighborhood, can provide many nutritional benefits. And so here I'll just highlight this study. If you want to learn more about this, this is a really nice study done in 2010 by a group of researchers that talk about how home gardens are neglected hotspots of agrobiodiversity and cultural biodiversity. And in our research in Berlin and in Munich, we have found that urban community gardens can host a wide array of plants, both cultivated and wild plants. And so here I'll just bring in some aspects from our own research here at the Technical University of Munich, where in our research in Berlin, in 18 community gardens, we have found over 400 different taxa. Many of them were cultivated species, but actually a lot of plants are wild species that are growing next to their cultivated neighbors. And many of these plant species, these wild plant species, are on the red list of Germany and in Berlin specifically. So we have then plants, when we consider them red listed, that they are in some form of endanger conservation concern. So what we have found is that we have in these gardens what we may consider lost plants, like this one on the left, what we call false cleavers in English, that we found in a raised bed in a rooftop community garden. And this is a typical field plant or Ackerpflanze that was extinct in Berlin. And it is bizarre that we found it on a rooftop, but it may be that the species was introduced with substrate or the planting material that is brought into these novel ecosystems of rooftop gardens. And so here we see that, yeah, these rooftop gardens also are contributing something to the agrobiodiversity and biodiversity of a city. We also found forgotten plants like old crops and medicinal herbs like motherwort here in the middle. And we've also found novel plants, including soybean and shiso that are growing in these gardens, likely due to the multicultural backgrounds of gardeners or gardeners experimenting with different plants. So we see that there's a lot of crop diversification in gardens, and that, yeah, this may be intentional, but it may also, and it may be due to human migration and the multiculturalism of urban areas. So here is another nice and interesting study done by some researchers in Chicago, Illinois, in the United States, that reported that they're finding wild plants in cultivation for the first time in home gardens. And so it's really interesting to think about through experimentation by urban residents, even just within their backyards, we're adding we're adding surprising forms of biodiversity and agrobiodiversity to the landscape. And what this may do through plant diversity, we may have the benefit of, or a benefit on other forms of biodiversity or other higher trophic levels. So this is a study done by researchers in the United Kingdom that found that allotment gardens in particular, likely due to them providing habitat through plant diversity and especially flowering plants, can, potentially have a bigger impact on pollinators. And so they argue that pollinators may be especially benefited by this diversification of plants within these allotment gardens. I know I am, thank you. I know I'm getting close to my time, and I just should have about 5 more minutes. So when we talk about urban agriculture and ecosystem services, I won't say too much about this because Julia presented on it on Monday, but we see that urban agriculture in the city can provide habitat for urban biodiversity. So by having many different types of plants that, for example, flower at different times, we can promote insect diversity, but also thinking below the soil that we may enhance the habitat for soil dwelling organisms, potentially if we have some sort of like soil remediation processes also that we've been talking about the past few days. And through, if we have more biodiversity in the system, we probably have more interactions among these different forms of biodiversity. And this provides the basis for ecosystem functions and these ecosystem services like natural pest control, pollination, and both also above ground and below ground when we have soil organisms interacting with plants that then also in turn interact with mobile organisms. And gardens may also, and I guess urban agriculture can also be important for climate regulation. So by adding more vegetation and potentially reducing impervious surface and buildings and the density of buildings, we can potentially reduce urban heat. And so by adding vegetation, we could hopefully cool our neighborhoods, especially when we consider that cities are getting increasingly hotter or weather patterns are becoming increasingly more variable. And so just to wrap up, when we think about agricultural systems, what practices may make them more sustainable? Hopefully, we can diversify at the local to landscape scale. So adding plant diversity at the farm level, and then also adding different forms of agriculture at the landscape level, and also adding remnant habitat. We can add more heterogeneity that can buffer the system, but also the landscape from unexpected events. Whether that's social or whether that's environmental. And we have many different interacting elements as part of agroecology. So we've been discussing the past few days, both in rural and urban contexts, how all of these different elements interact. And this is a diagram provided by the FAO. And what we want to see, if we want to understand and evaluate the sustainability of the system and at what level a system may be in its transformation to being more sustainable, we can use this framework that is provided by the agroecologist Stephen Gleesman. And he sees that when we have these different levels that occur incrementally until we may have a transformation of an agroecosystem. Oh, I know I have an animation where we are not just thinking that, okay, maybe we're substituting nutrients, or we are incorporating more nutrient cycling, or having some more basic enhancing biomass, or optimizing organic matter decomposition, to actually focusing on governance and social justice aspects of the food system. And so we can think about this in a rural agricultural context, how we are moving from a more sustainable and equitable food system. And urban agriculture is also a part of this global food system and the global urban or the global agricultural system. So we also need to think about, okay, for urban farms, for urban gardens, for urban agriculture broadly, how do we work at these different elements incrementally and also transformationally to have a more sustainable and equitable urban food system. And so I think I think that there are some challenges when we try to apply agroecological principles and practices to urban agriculture. Let me look in the chat to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
You've got
this is my second
13 minutes.
This is my, basically my second to last slide. So I just want to leave you all with some questions, and these are, there's no really yes or no. And so I think we can just have an interesting discussion in the next few minutes of today, and then also gladly in the next couple of days that we have left together, is how do we apply principles of agroecology to urban agroecosystems? What makes urban food systems sustainable, and what indicators can we use? And often agroecology may want to use nature as a reference point, but mimicking nature in cities is actually really difficult. So what is historically natural in an urban system is complicated because urban agroecosystems rely on this day-to-day management and cultivation by people, and landscapes that continue to transform in the past and now in the future, into the future. And urban agroecology may also encompass practices that are not necessarily grounded in very land-based systems. So when we think about urban foraging and using, land that is not necessarily yours, or using, more alternative practices. So with that, I will leave or summarize with just saying that, we can apply agroecological principles to study urban agricultural systems, and this will require looking beyond just one discipline and looking to work inter and multidisciplinarity, thinking about both ecological complexity of a system where we have many different interacting elements from soils and plants and animals, but also integrating humans and their values and their behaviors and their backgrounds into also understanding the complexity of these systems. So with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to take questions in the last minutes that we have. Sorry that I talked too much.
No problem. We've got more than 10 minutes left, so 13 minutes. No, yeah, 12 minutes. So
no, actually, I think that we have 3 minutes for questions.
We only have 3 minutes. I know.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
It's my fault. I tried to talk slowly instead of talking my usual very fast paced.
No problem. There's one question about whether the urban farming can be economically viable and competitive compared to rural farming. And there's another question about energy efficiency of urban farming compared to, let's say, large scale. An example is given winter wheat, energy efficiency of winter wheat production.
Yeah, this is a really good question. My answer is that it depends. So yeah, we have good examples of where urban agriculture can be incredibly resource efficient and be very cost effective and sell products that are kind of niche. So a good example is there are a couple of rooftop greenhouses in downtown New York and in Chicago as well that are growing tomatoes and strawberries and some what we call niche or specialty crops by using the building's heat and energy. So I think the building is like a bakery, and so they use the heat from the bakery to grow using natural lighting these specialty crops. And then they sell the crops for higher than market value because they can sell strawberries and tomatoes in the wintertime when some of these products are not necessarily available in New York or in Chicago. And so this is, I think, a nice example where based on the system and based on how it uses the resources available to it, it can be very efficient and profitable. But there's also examples where, an indoor system, if it's relying on only external inputs, it may be very energy intensive and cost intensive to run. Claudia will talk maybe about some of those challenges tomorrow. But then we also have some community gardens and allotment gardens that there's some studies that have done this too, that they may use resources very intensively. So a lot of water is used to grow crops, a lot of soil that is not necessarily peat free is used, and where they also use insecticides and pesticides. And so this is an area that through education we need to improve upon, and also through governance and regulation of these community gardens and allotment gardens.